The clock on the dashboard showed 11:47 p.m. as David pulled his silver Honda into the quiet neighborhood. The streetlights cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns and expensive houses that lined both sides of the road. He had finished his last Uber ride 30 minutes ago, but here he was, driving through one of the city's wealthiest areas on his own time. The reason was simple. His last passenger, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chun, had accidentally left her phone in his back seat. She had been so kind during the ride, telling him stories about her grandchildren and thanking him multiple times for helping her with her groceries. When David found the phone wedged between the seat cushions, he knew he had to return it tonight. Mrs. Chun had mentioned she was expecting an important call from her doctor in the morning. David had called the number on the phone's emergency contact list and spoken to Mrs. Chun's daughter. She had given him the address and thanked him profusely for going out of his way. It was the right thing to do, David thought as he checked the house numbers. His grandmother had always taught him to treat others the way he wanted to be treated. The neighborhood was the kind of place where houses started at $1 million and went up from there. David had driven through here many times for ride requests, but he always felt a bit out of place. His Honda was clean and well-maintained, but it certainly didn't belong in driveways next to Mercedes and BMWs. He found the address and pulled into the driveway of a large colonial house with white columns. The porch light was on, and he could see someone waiting by the front door. David grabbed the phone from his passenger seat and stepped out of his car. The woman who met him at the door was Mrs. Chun's daughter, Linda. She looked relieved as David handed over the phone. "Thank you so much for bringing this back," she said, trying to hand him a $20 bill. "Mom would have been lost without it." David politely declined the money. "No need for that. I'm just glad I could help." They chatted for a few minutes about Mrs. Chun's condition and her upcoming doctor's appointment. Linda thanked him again before David walked back to his car. He was feeling good about the small act of kindness as he backed out of the driveway. That good feeling lasted exactly 30 seconds. Red and blue lights suddenly filled his rearview mirror. David's heart sank as he pulled over to the curb. He had been driving carefully, staying well under the speed limit. His registration was current, his license was valid, and he hadn't been drinking. He couldn't think of any reason for the stop. David turned off his engine and rolled down his windows. He placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. His military training had taught him to stay calm in stressful situations, and his father had taught him how to behave during police encounters. Heavy footsteps approached his driver's side window. Officer Derek Sullivan appeared, shining a flashlight directly into David's eyes. Sullivan was a big man, over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders. His uniform was crisp, but his expression was anything but professional. "License and registration," Sullivan demanded without any greeting or explanation for the stop. "Yes, sir," David replied calmly. "Can you tell me why you pulled me over?" Sullivan's expression hardened. "Just get your documents." David slowly reached for his wallet, announcing each movement. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my back pocket." He pulled out his license and then reached for the glove compartment. "Now I'm getting my registration from the glove box." Sullivan snatched the documents without a word and studied them with his flashlight. David could see another police car pulling up behind Sullivan's vehicle. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Sullivan asked, his tone accusatory. "I was returning a passenger's phone," David explained politely. "She left it in my car after her ride earlier tonight." "Sure she did?" Sullivan said with obvious disbelief. "What's your real business here?" David felt a chill run down his spine. The officer's tone and body language were setting off alarm bells. "Officer, I can show you the Uber app on my phone if you'd like. I can also give you the contact information for the family I just helped." "Don't tell me what you can do," Sullivan snapped. "I'll decide what I need to see." A second officer approached from the passenger side of David's car. This one was younger and seemed less aggressive, but he didn't say anything to contradict his partner. "Step out of the vehicle," Sullivan ordered. "Can you tell me why?" David asked, still keeping his voice respectful. "Because I said so. Now get out." David knew he had no choice. He slowly opened his door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible at all times. Sullivan immediately moved closer, invading his personal space in an obvious attempt to intimidate him. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," Sullivan commanded. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong," David said as he complied. "I was just helping someone return their phone." "That's what they all say," Sullivan muttered as he began patting David down roughly. "Guys like you are always just helping someone when they get caught somewhere they don't belong." The comment hit David like a physical blow. "Guys like you?" The meaning was crystal clear, and it had nothing to do with David being an Uber driver. Sullivan's search was unnecessarily aggressive and humiliating. He went through David's pockets, checked his wallet thoroughly, and made him remove his jacket despite the cool night air. "What's this?" Sullivan asked, pulling David's phone from his pocket. "That's my phone," David replied. "I need to check it for evidence." "Evidence of what?" "You still haven't told me what I'm supposed to have done." Sullivan's face reddened. You giving me attitude?" "No, sir, I'm just asking what law I've broken." The younger officer finally spoke up. "Maybe we should just run his license and let him go if everything checks out?" Sullivan shot his partner a sharp look. "I'll decide when we're done here," he turned back to David. "I think you're dealing drugs in this neighborhood." Rich people, late at night, perfect setup. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Officer, I'm not a drug dealer. I'm an Uber driver. I can show you my driver profile, my ratings, everything." "Sure you can," Sullivan said sarcastically. "Everyone's got a story." The situation was escalating quickly, and David knew he needed to protect himself. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached for his phone. "What are you doing?" Sullivan demanded. "I'm going to record this interaction for both our protection," David said calmly. That's when Sullivan completely lost his composure. "Don't you dare point that camera at me!" Sullivan shouted, grabbing for the phone. David pulled it back slightly. "I have the right to record police interactions in public." "You have the right to follow my orders." Sullivan was now shouting loud enough to wake the neighbors. "Turn that thing off or I'll arrest you for obstruction." David knew the law. He had every right to record as long as he didn't interfere with the officer's duties. But he also knew that being right didn't always matter when you were alone on a dark street with an angry cop. The night was about to get much worse. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. David held his phone steady, the camera recording everything as Officer Sullivan's face grew redder by the second. The younger officer, Thompson according to his name tag, looked increasingly uncomfortable as his partner's behavior spiraled out of control. "I said, turn that camera off," Sullivan barked, stepping even closer to David. "You're interfering with a police investigation." "I'm standing still with my hands visible," David replied calmly, though his heart was racing. "I'm not interfering with anything. I'm just documenting what's happening for everyone's protection." Sullivan's jaw clenched. "Protection? Who do you think you need protection from?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. David chose his words carefully. "Officer, I just want to make sure there's a clear record of this interaction. That protects both of us." "Don't try to tell me how to do my job," Sullivan snarled. "I've been wearing this badge for 15 years. I know when someone's up to no good and you reek of trouble." David noticed movement in one of the nearby houses. A porch light had come on, and he could see a silhouette in the window. The commotion was starting to wake the neighborhood. "Can you please tell me what I'm suspected of doing?" David asked again, keeping his voice level. "I've shown you my license and registration. Everything is in order." "Everything's in order?" Sullivan laughed bitterly. "You're driving around this neighborhood at midnight with no good reason to be. Here, that's called casing houses, and I know criminal behavior when I see it. I told you I was returning a phone to a passenger. I can give you the family's contact information to verify my story." "Oh, I'm sure you've got all kinds of stories prepared," Sullivan said with contempt. "You people always do." There it was. Again, you people. David felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to remain calm. Getting angry would only make things worse. Thompson finally spoke up again. "Derek, maybe we should just verify his story and move on." The license came back. Clean, Sullivan whirled on his partner. Did I ask for your opinion? I'm the senior officer here, and I say we're not done. He turned back to David, his eyes filled with something that looked like hatred. Here's what I think happened. I think you were looking for houses to rob. Rich. Neighborhood, late at night, checking for unlocked cars or easy targets. The phone story is just cover in case you got caught. That's completely untrue, David said firmly. I've never stolen anything in my life. Right, Sullivan scoffed. And I suppose you've never been arrested either? Actually, no, I haven't. Sullivan looked genuinely surprised, but quickly covered it with more aggression. Well, there's a first time for everything. By now, lights were coming on in several houses. David could see people peering through windows and at least one person standing on their porch. Someone was probably calling 911, though David wasn't sure if that would help or hurt the situation. Look, David said, trying a different approach. I understand you're just doing your job, but I'm not a criminal. I work hard, I pay my taxes, and I've never been in trouble with the law. I was just trying to help an elderly woman get her phone back. Save the sob story, Sullivan said dismissively. I've heard it all before. I'm just a hard-working guy trying to make it. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. You all sound the same. The comment stung because David knew exactly what Sullivan meant by you all. This wasn't about him being an Uber driver or being in the wrong neighborhood. This was about the color of his skin, plain and simple. David had faced racism before, but usually it was more subtle. A store clerk following him around, a restaurant hostess claiming they were fully booked when empty tables were visible, job interviews that went nowhere despite his qualifications, but this was different. This was raw, open hostility from someone, with a badge and a gun. Officer Sullivan, David said, reading the name tag, I respect law enforcement. My grandfather was a police officer in Detroit for 30 years. I know you have a difficult job, and I'm not trying to make it harder. Don't try to play the family card with me, Sullivan sneered. And don't think you can butter me up by pretending. To respect cops? If you really respected law enforcement, you'd turn off that camera and submit to a proper search. I've already submitted to a search, David pointed out. You patted me down and found nothing illegal. That was just a preliminary. Search. I want to search your vehicle. David's heart sank. He knew his rights, but he also knew how easily this situation could spiral completely out of control. Do you have probable cause for a vehicle search? Sullivan's eyes flashed with anger. Did you just question my authority? I'm just asking. About my constitutional rights. Your constitutional rights? Sullivan laughed harshly. How about my right to go home safe at the end of my shift? How about the rights of the people in this neighborhood not to be terrorized by criminals? I'm not a criminal, David said firmly. That's what they all say. Thompson, call for backup. This guy's being uncooperative. Thompson looked confused. Backup? Derek, he's been completely cooperative. He's answered all your questions and submitted to a search. Are you questioning my judgment? Sullivan asked dangerously. Thompson backed down immediately. No, just maybe we don't need backup for a simple traffic stop. This stopped being a simple traffic stop the minute he started giving me attitude and refusing to cooperate, Sullivan said. Now make the call. David watched helplessly as Thompson reluctantly reached for his radio. This was getting out of hand fast, and he wasn't sure how to de-escalate the situation. Officer Sullivan, he tried again. I really don't want any trouble. I just want to go home to my family. Should have thought of that before you decided to cruise around this neighborhood looking for trouble, Sullivan replied. What kind of family man drives around at midnight anyway? I work nights driving for Uber to help pay for college, David explained. I'm studying business administration. College? Sullivan laughed mockingly. Let me guess you're going to tell me you're some kind of honor student too? Actually, David was on the dean's list, but he sensed that sharing that information would only make Sullivan more hostile. More police cars were arriving now. David could see at least 2 additional vehicles pulling up, their red and blue lights painting the quiet neighborhood in alternating colors. What had started as a simple traffic stop was turning into a major incident. "Great," Sullivan said with satisfaction as more officers approached. "Now we can do this properly." David felt a chill run down his spine. With his phone still recording, he watched as Sullivan's backup arrived, wondering if any of them would be willing to stand up to their colleagues' obvious misconduct. The night was about to get much, much worse. 4 police officers now surrounded David's car, their vehicles creating a semicircle of flashing lights that turned the quiet residential street into something resembling a crime scene. Neighbors had emerged from their houses, some recording the incident with their own phones from their porches and driveways. Officer Sullivan seemed energized by the arrival of his backup. He strutted around like he was in complete control of the situation, briefing the new arrivals on what he claimed had happened. Subject was acting suspiciously in the neighborhood, Sullivan told the other officers, his voice loud enough for David to hear every word. Claims he was returning a phone, but his story doesn't add up. He's been uncooperative and argumentative since the initial contact. David wanted to object, but his military training told him to stay quiet and let the situation play out. Sometimes the best strategy was to avoid escalating things further. One of the new officers, a woman with sergeant stripes, approached David. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Rodriguez. Can you tell me what happened here tonight?" Finally, David thought. Someone who might actually listen to reason. "Sergeant, I was returning a phone that a passenger left in my Uber," David explained calmly. "I have the Uber app on my phone that shows the completed ride, and I can provide contact information for the family I just helped." Sergeant Rodriguez nodded. "That's easy enough to verify. Can you show me the app?" David started to reach for his phone, but Sullivan quickly intervened. "Sergeant, he's been recording this entire interaction," Sullivan said accusingly. "I've ordered him multiple times to stop filming, but he's refused to comply." "Recording police interactions is legal," Sergeant Rodriguez replied matter-of-factly, "as long as he's not interfering with our duties." Sullivan's face darkened. "He's been interfering from the moment I made contact, questioning my authority, refusing to follow orders, acting belligerent." David couldn't stay quiet anymore. "That's not true. I've been respectful throughout this entire encounter. I answered all questions and submitted to a search." "See?" Sullivan said triumphantly. "There he goes again, arguing with police officers." Sergeant Rodriguez looked back and forth between Sullivan and David, clearly trying to assess the situation. David could see her weighing what she was hearing against what she was observing. "Let me see that phone app," she said to David. David unlocked his phone and opened the Uber driver app. The completed trip from earlier that evening was right there, showing Mrs. Chun as the passenger and her daughter's address as the destination. Sergeant Rodriguez studied the screen carefully. "This does show a completed ride to this neighborhood." "Earlier tonight, apps can be faked," Sullivan said quickly. "Besides, that doesn't prove he wasn't here for criminal purposes." David felt a spark of hope when he saw Sergeant Rodriguez's expression. She was clearly skeptical of Sullivan's claims. "Officer Sullivan," she said carefully, "what specific criminal activity do you suspect?" "Drug dealing, casing houses for burglary, could be any number of things," Sullivan replied. "The point is, he doesn't belong in this neighborhood." Those last words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. David saw Sergeant Rodriguez's expression change as she realized what Sullivan had really just said. "Doesn't belong?" She repeated. Sullivan realized his mistake but doubled down instead of backing off. "You know what I mean? Someone driving around here at midnight? It's suspicious. I've made deliveries in this neighborhood at all hours," another officer spoke up. "Uber drivers work late shifts all the time." Sullivan was losing control of the narrative, and David could see him getting more desperate and angry. "I want to search his vehicle," Sullivan announced. "I smell marijuana." David's blood ran cold. He didn't smoke marijuana and never had. His car smelled like the pine air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror and nothing else. "I don't smell anything," Sergeant Rodriguez said, moving closer to David's car and taking a deliberate sniff. "I have a more sensitive nose," Sullivan insisted. 15 years of experience. I know what I smell. David realized what was happening. Sullivan was manufacturing probable cause for a search, hoping to find something he could use to justify the stop. When that didn't work, he would probably plant something. "Officer, I don't use drugs," David said firmly. "I've never used drugs. You're welcome to have me take a field sobriety test or bring in a canine unit. And don't tell me how to do." "My job?" Sullivan exploded. "I've had enough of your attitude." That's when things went from bad to catastrophic. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Sullivan ordered, reaching for his handcuffs. "On what charge?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked, stepping forward. "Obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, possession of a controlled substance." Sullivan rattled off. "What controlled substance?" Sergeant Rodriguez demanded. "We haven't found any drugs." "The investigation is ongoing," Sullivan said, grabbing David's arm roughly. David's military training kicked in. He knew how to remain calm under pressure, how to protect himself while being restrained, and how to avoid giving his attackers any excuse to escalate their use of force. He didn't resist, but he also didn't make it easy for Sullivan to manhandle him. "I'm not resisting," David said clearly, making sure his voice carried to the other officers and the neighbors who were recording. "I'm complying with all lawful orders." Sullivan wrestled David's arms behind his back with unnecessary force, deliberately causing pain. "Stop resisting." "I'm not resisting," David repeated, louder this time. "He's clearly not resisting, Sergeant," Rodriguez said. "Sullivan, ease up." But Sullivan was beyond reason now. He slammed David against the car, causing a dent in the door panel. David's face was pressed against the cold metal as Sullivan applied the handcuffs so tightly they cut into his wrists. "Search his pockets again," Sullivan ordered Thompson. "I already searched him," Thompson protested weakly. "Search him again. More thoroughly this time." David felt hands going through his pockets more roughly than before. He had been through combat deployments where he faced enemy fire, but this felt more violating than anything he had experienced in war. "Nothing," Thompson reported. Sullivan's frustration was obvious. Without evidence of a crime, his arrest was looking more and more like what it really was, a hate-motivated abuse of power. That's when David saw Sullivan walk back to his patrol car and return with something in his hand. Well, Sullivan said loudly. "Look what I found in his pocket." He held up a small plastic bag with what appeared to be white powder inside. David's heart stopped. "That's not mine. I've never seen that before in my life." "They always say that," Sullivan said with fake sadness. "Shame to see a young man throw his life away with drugs." "You planted that?" David said, his voice rising for the first time. "That came from your car, not my pocket." "Are you accusing me of planting evidence?" Sullivan asked with mock indignation. "Yes, I am," David said without hesitation. "Because that's exactly what you just did." Sullivan's smile was pure evil. "That's a serious accusation. I think we need to add assaulting an officer's character to the charges." Sergeant Rodriguez looked deeply troubled, but she was caught in an impossible position. If she contradicted Sullivan's account, she would be calling a fellow officer a liar. But if she went along with it, she would be party to a false arrest. "The whole thing's been recorded," David said desperately. "Check the cameras. Check my phone recording. You'll see he planted that evidence." "Unfortunately, cameras can't show everything," Sullivan said. "They can't show what was hidden deep in someone's pocket." David realized with growing horror that Sullivan had done this before. He was too smooth, too practiced in his lies. How many other innocent people had been destroyed by this man's racism and corruption? As Sullivan read him his rights in a mocking tone, David tried to stay focused on what came next. He would need a lawyer immediately. He would need to preserve the video evidence. He would need to contact his family, but first he would need to survive whatever came next. And looking at the hatred in Sullivan's eyes, David wasn't sure that survival was guaranteed. The American dream felt very far away. As the handcuffs cut into his wrists and his future hung in the balance, the video appeared on social media at 3:47 a.m., just 4 hours after David's arrest. A neighbor named Mrs. Patterson had been unable to sleep after witnessing the incident outside her house. She had recorded the entire encounter from her bedroom window, and something about what she saw didn't sit right with her. The footage was crystal clear. Her phone had captured everything: Sullivan's aggressive behavior from the start, David's calm responses the moment Sullivan walked to his patrol car and returned with the evidence bag, and David's immediate protest that the drugs had been planted. Mrs. Patterson uploaded the video to Twitter with a simple caption: "This happened outside my house tonight. An innocent man was set up by a racist cop. This needs to be seen." Within an hour, the video had been shared 50 times. By sunrise, it had been viewed over 10,000 times. By noon, it was trending nationally with the hashtag Justice for David. Local news stations picked up the story for their morning broadcasts. The footage was impossible to ignore, a clear case of what appeared to be police misconduct captured in stunning detail. Good morning, I'm Jennifer Walsh with Channel 7 News. We begin today with disturbing footage of a police encounter that has sparked outrage across social media. The video appears to show an officer planting evidence during the arrest of an Uber driver in the wealthy Hillcrest neighborhood. The story grew throughout the day. David's arrest photo was released by the police department, showing a dignified young man in a business casual shirt, looking tired but maintaining his composure despite everything he had endured. Local civil rights leader Reverend James Thompson held a press conference outside the police station. "What we witnessed in that video is not just an attack on one man," Reverend Thompson declared to a crowd of supporters and media. "It's an attack on justice itself. When officers plant evidence, they don't just destroy one life, they undermine the entire foundation of our legal system." The police department initially defended Sullivan's actions. Chief Peterson held his own press conference, flanked by union representatives. "Officer Sullivan is a 15-year veteran with an exemplary record," Chief Peterson stated. "The department stands behind our officers and the integrity of their investigations. We caution against rushing to judgment based on incomplete video footage that may not show the full context of the situation." But the video spoke for itself. Even casual viewers could see Sullivan's hostile behavior from the beginning. His repeated references to David not belonging in the neighborhood, and the suspicious timing of the evidence discovery. Legal experts weighed in on television news programs throughout the day. "What we see in this video is textbook evidence planting," explained former prosecutor Linda Martinez during a CNN interview. "The officer walks back to his car, returns with evidence, and then claims to find it on the suspect. No reasonable person would believe that narrative." David's family held their own press conference with civil rights attorney Michael Roberts. David's mother, Patricia, spoke through tears. "My son is a good man," she said, her voice trembling. "He works 2 jobs to pay for college. He's never been in trouble with the law. He was just trying to help an elderly woman get her phone back, and look what happened to him." David's younger sister Angela, a college sophomore, was more direct in her anger. "This officer destroyed my brother's life because he didn't think a black man belonged in that neighborhood," she said. "How is that different from what happened 50 years ago? How is that progress?" The story gained national attention when it was picked up by cable news networks. Protests began forming outside the police station, with demonstrators demanding Sullivan's immediate termination and prosecution. The hashtag Justice for David was joined by police accountability and planted evidence as the story spread across social media platforms. Celebrities began sharing the video, adding their voices to the growing chorus of outrage, but not everyone was convinced of David's innocence. Conservative commentators and police union representatives pushed back against the narrative. "We're seeing a rush to judgment based on a video that doesn't tell the whole story," said Police Union President Tom Bradley during a radio interview. "Officer Sullivan has served this community faithfully for 15 years. He's put dangerous criminals behind bars and made our streets safer." Online comment sections became battlegrounds between those supporting David and those defending Sullivan. The divide often fell along predictable lines, with discussions quickly devolving into arguments about race, police authority, and criminal justice reform. David remained in jail, unable to make the $50,000 bail set by the judge. The charges against him were serious: possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute, resisting arrest, and obstruction of justice. If convicted, he faced up to 10 years in prison. His employer, a local auto parts store where he worked during the day, placed him on indefinite suspension pending the outcome of his case. The university where he was studying sent a letter informing him that his enrollment was under review due to his arrest. Everything David had worked for was crumbling around him. Attorney Michael Roberts filed an emergency motion to have the charges dismissed, arguing that the evidence was clearly planted and that David's constitutional rights had been violated. "My client is the victim of a hate crime committed by someone sworn to protect and serve," Roberts told reporters outside the courthouse. "The video evidence is overwhelming. This arrest was motivated by racism, pure and simple." The district attorney's office found itself in a difficult position. The video was damaging, but they couldn't simply dismiss charges without a thorough investigation. They announced that the case would be reviewed by a special prosecutor. Meanwhile, David's story began to resonate beyond just civil rights activists. Veterans groups started paying attention when they learned David had served in the military. Small business owners related to his story of working multiple jobs to pay for college. College students saw themselves in his struggle to build a better life through education. The video continued to spread, viewed millions of times across different platforms. Late-night talk show hosts made jokes about Sullivan's obvious evidence planting. Editorial boards at major newspapers called for his prosecution. But in his cell, David wasn't thinking about hashtags or television coverage. He was thinking about his future, which seemed to be slipping away with each passing hour. His cellmate was a career criminal named Tony who had been through the system multiple times. "First time?" Tony asked, noticing David's obvious distress. "Yeah," David replied quietly. "What they get you for?" "Nothing," David said. "I didn't do anything wrong." Tony laughed bitterly. "Man, everyone in here says that, but I saw you on the news. That cop really did you dirty? You saw the video?" "Everyone's seen it. Guards, inmates, visitors, it's all over the place. The cop planted that stuff on you clear as day." For the first time since his arrest, David felt a small spark of hope. If the evidence was that clear, surely justice would prevail, but Tony's next words brought him back to reality. Of course, being right and proving it in court are two different things. System's rigged, man, always has been. As David lay on his narrow bunk that night, staring at the ceiling of his cell, he wondered if Tony was right. Would the video be enough? Would anyone believe him over a 15-year police veteran? Outside the jail, the protests continued into the night with supporters demanding his release and Sullivan's arrest. The battle for David's freedom was just beginning. The pressure on Police Chief Peterson was mounting from every direction. The mayor's office was fielding hundreds of calls demanding action. The city council had scheduled an emergency meeting. Protesters had been outside the police station for 3 straight days, and national media trucks lined the street. Chief Peterson knew he had to act decisively, even if it meant investigating one of his own officers. He called in Detective Captain Sarah Williams, the department's most respected investigator, and assigned her to conduct a thorough internal affairs investigation. "I want this done by the book," Peterson told Williams in his office. "Leave no stone unturned. If Sullivan did what that video suggests, I want to know about it." Detective Williams had been with the department for 20 years and had investigated dozens of officer misconduct cases. She was known for her fairness and integrity, qualities that had earned her respect from both fellow officers and community leaders. She started with the basics, reviewing Sullivan's personnel file, examining his arrest record, and looking for patterns of complaints or problematic behavior. What she found was troubling, but not uncommon. Sullivan had received several citizen complaints over the years, mostly from minority residents claiming harassment or excessive force. Each complaint had been investigated and ultimately dismissed for lack of evidence, but Williams noticed something interesting in the pattern. Nearly all of Sullivan's arrests in the past 5 years had been in minority communities or involved minority suspects. His arrest rate was significantly higher than other officers working similar beats. The video evidence was the next priority. Williams obtained copies of all available footage, the neighbor's cell phone video, David's phone recording, and the dash cam footage from multiple police vehicles. The neighbor's video was the most damaging to Sullivan's case. It clearly showed him walking to his patrol car after the initial search came up empty, then returning with something in his hand. When enhanced by the crime lab, the footage showed Sullivan pulling a small bag from his own pocket before discovering it on David. David's phone recording captured the entire audio of the encounter, including Sullivan's inflammatory comments about David not belonging in the neighborhood and his references to "you people." The dash cam footage corroborated the timeline and showed Sullivan's increasingly aggressive behavior throughout the encounter. Williams interviewed each officer who was present that night. Thompson, the young officer who had expressed doubts about Sullivan's actions, was clearly uncomfortable during his interview. "Did you see Officer Sullivan find the alleged narcotics on the suspect?" Williams asked. Thompson shifted in his chair. "Well, he said he found them in the suspect's pocket during a more thorough search. But did you personally observe him remove the substance from the suspect's pocket?" Thompson was quiet for a long moment. "No, I was positioned on the other side of the vehicle at that time." Sergeant Rodriguez was more direct in her concerns. "I've been thinking about that night," she told Williams. "Something felt off about the whole situation. The suspect was completely cooperative, and then suddenly we have drug evidence that appeared out of nowhere." "Are you suggesting Officer Sullivan planted evidence?" Rodriguez chose her words carefully. "I'm saying the timeline and circumstances raise questions that deserve investigation." Williams decided to dig deeper into David's background. If Sullivan's accusations were true, there should be some evidence of criminal activity or drug use in David's history. What she found instead surprised her completely. David's military records painted a picture of an exceptional soldier. He had enlisted straight out of high school and served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. His service record was spotless, commendations for bravery, leadership awards, and glowing evaluations from his commanding officers, but it was the classified portions of his file that made Williams sit up and take notice. After obtaining proper security clearances, she learned that David wasn't just any soldier. He was a Marine Corps sniper with confirmed combat kills and multiple medals for valor. The records showed that David had been part of an elite unit that trained other military snipers, including Navy SEAL teams. His marksmanship scores were off the charts, and his psychological evaluations described him as calm under pressure, disciplined, and completely reliable. David had been medically retired after suffering injuries in an IED explosion during his final deployment. His disability rating entitled him to benefits, but the payments weren't enough to support himself while attending college. Williams called David's former commanding officer, Colonel James Mitchell, who was now stationed at the Pentagon. "David Washington?" Colonel Mitchell said when Williams explained why she was calling. "That man is a genuine American hero. He saved my life and the lives of countless other soldiers during his deployments." "Can you tell me about his character?" "Absolutely sterling." Mitchell replied without hesitation. "I would trust David with my life, my family's lives, anything. The idea that he would be involved with drugs is absolutely laughable." "The man doesn't even drink alcohol," Williams pressed further. "Did he ever have any disciplinary issues in the military?" "Never, not once." David was the kind of soldier you build an army around. When he was training our SEAL snipers, they all looked up to him like he was some kind of legend. The more Williams learned about David, the more Sullivan's accusations seemed ridiculous. This wasn't some street criminal caught dealing drugs. This was a decorated war veteran working 2 jobs to pay for college while caring for his disabled mother. Williams expanded her investigation to include Sullivan's past cases. She pulled arrest records, court transcripts, and evidence logs from his previous drug arrests. A disturbing pattern emerged. Sullivan had an unusually high rate of drug Possession arrests, particularly involving small amounts of cocaine or heroin found during traffic stops. His success rate at finding drugs was nearly 3 times higher than the department average. More troubling, several of Sullivan's arrests had resulted in plea bargains rather than trials. Defense attorneys had apparently advised their clients to take deals rather than fight cases where the evidence seemed questionable. Williams interviewed 3 defense attorneys who had represented Sullivan's previous arrestees. "Off the record," said attorney David Chun, "I always suspected Sullivan was planting evidence, but proving it was nearly impossible without video evidence. My clients were usually young, poor, and minority. Juries tend to believe police officers over defendants with criminal histories." Another attorney, Maria Santos, was more direct. "Sullivan is a dirty cop. Everyone in the public defender's office knows it. We'd been waiting for someone to finally catch him in the act." Williams realized she was looking at a case that went far beyond David's arrest. She was potentially uncovering a pattern of corruption that had destroyed numerous lives over many years. She brought her preliminary findings to Chief Peterson. "Chief, we have a serious problem," Williams began. "The evidence strongly suggests that Officer Sullivan planted drugs on the suspect. But it's worse than that. I think he's been doing this for years." Peterson's face went pale. "How bad is it?" "Potentially dozens of false arrests, civil rights violations, possible federal crimes. And now we have video evidence that could expose the whole thing." The implications were staggering. If Williams was right, the city faced massive lawsuits from wrongfully convicted defendants. The department's reputation would be destroyed. Officers' careers would be ruined by association, but Peterson knew he had only one choice. "Continue the investigation," he ordered. "I want a complete report within the week. And Williams? This stays between us until we have all the facts." As Williams left the chief's office, she knew she was about to drop a bombshell that would shake the entire city. The decorated war hero sitting in jail wasn't just the victim of one rogue cop's racism. He was the key to exposing a massive corruption scandal that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The leak came from an unexpected source. Detective Williams had been careful to keep her investigation confidential, but someone in the records department noticed the unusual number of military files being requested and mentioned it to a friend who worked for the local newspaper. By Thursday morning, investigative reporter Jennifer Hayes was digging into David's background. What she found made her jaw drop. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Hayes asked her source at the Department of Veterans Affairs. She was staring at David's military record on her computer screen, hardly believing what she was reading. "Completely." "Sure," her source confirmed. "This guy isn't just any veteran. He's a legitimate war hero. Silver Star, Purple Heart, Bronze Star with V device for valor. He was one of the most decorated snipers in the Marine Corps." Hayes spent the entire day verifying the information through multiple sources. She contacted the Pentagon, spoke with Veterans Affairs officials, and tracked down former military personnel who had served with David. The story she wrote that evening would change everything. Shocking revelation: arrested Uber driver is decorated. War hero who trained Navy SEALs, the article detailed. David's military service in terms that made him sound like something out of an action movie. 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan. Over 40 confirmed enemy kills as a sniper. Numerous commendations for bravery under fire. But the most stunning revelation was David's role training Navy SEAL snipers at the Elite Special Operations Training Center. For 2 years before his medical retirement, David had been one of only 12 instructors qualified to train the military's most elite warriors in advanced marksmanship and combat tactics. The story included quotes from Colonel Mitchell and other high-ranking officers who described David as one of the finest soldiers they had ever commanded. David Washington represents the very best of American military service, Colonel Mitchell was quoted as saying. He risked his life repeatedly to protect his fellow soldiers and his country. The idea that this man would be involved with drugs is not just wrong, it's offensive to everyone who served with him. The article also included a photograph of David in his dress uniform. his chest covered with ribbons and medals, standing at attention during a ceremony where he received the Silver Star. The contrast between that image and his arrest mugshot was stark and powerful. The story broke online at 6 p.m. and immediately went viral. Within hours, it was being shared across social media platforms by veterans, military families, and supporters of David's case. The revelation completely changed the narrative around David's arrest. Suddenly, this wasn't just another story about police misconduct. This was about a decorated war hero being framed by a racist cop. Veterans organizations across the country issued statements of support. The veterans of foreign wars posted on their official social media accounts, "We stand with Marine Sergeant David Washington, a true American hero who served his country with honor and distinction." The American Legion called for a federal investigation into David's arrest and the immediate suspension of Officer Sullivan. Military blogs and websites picked up the story, spreading it throughout the veteran community. Active duty service members began sharing the article, expressing outrage that one of their own was being treated this way. The story reached the highest levels of military leadership. General Robert Hayes, the Marine Corps Commandant, issued a rare public statement about an ongoing civilian legal case. Sergeant Washington exemplified the values and dedication that make the Marine Corps the finest fighting force in the world. The general statement read, "Every Marine is disturbed by the circumstances surrounding his arrest, and we are monitoring this situation closely." Television news programs scrambled to update their coverage. The story was no longer just about police misconduct. It was about how American heroes were being treated in their own country. Cable news networks brought in military analysts to explain David's service record and the significance of his role training Navy SEALs. "To put this in perspective," explained retired Navy SEAL Commander Tom Brady during a CNN interview, "there are only a handful of snipers qualified to train SEAL Team 6 operators. This man was at the absolute pinnacle of military marksmanship and tactical excellence." The revelation also brought forward other veterans who had trained under David. Former Navy SEAL Petty Officer Mike Johnson appeared on Fox News to defend his former instructor. "Sergeant Washington was the best teacher I ever had in the military," Johnson said. "He taught me techniques that saved my life multiple times in combat. This man is a patriot and a hero, and what's being done to him is a disgrace." David's family was overwhelmed by the sudden attention. His mother, Patricia, gave her first television interview since the arrest. "I've always been proud of my son's service," she said, fighting back tears. "But I never imagined I'd have to use his war record to prove he's not a criminal. He shouldn't have to be a war hero for people to believe he's innocent." The contrast between David's character and Sullivan's behavior became even more stark in light of the military revelations. Social media users began creating memes comparing David's military decorations with Sullivan's history of controversial arrests. Legal experts weighed in on how the military service might impact the case. Juries are incredibly sympathetic to military veterans, especially decorated combat veterans, explained former federal prosecutor Lisa Chun during a television interview. "Any prosecutor looking at this case has to consider how a jury will react to putting a war hero on trial based on evidence that appears to have been planted." The story also prompted other veterans to come forward with their own experiences of police misconduct. Veterans groups reported a surge in calls from former service members who felt they had been unfairly targeted by law enforcement. David's attorney, Michael Roberts, held a press conference to address the new revelations. "My client didn't want his military service to be part of this story," Roberts explained. "He was arrested as a civilian, and he wanted to be judged as a civilian. But the facts of his service record demonstrate the absurdity of the charges against him." Roberts announced that he would be filing additional motions based on the military service revelations, including claims that David's reputation in the veteran community had been damaged by the false charges. "This man trained the warriors who protect our freedom," Roberts said. "Now we need to protect him from a corrupt system that failed him." The pressure on local officials became intense. The mayor's office was flooded with calls from veterans groups, military families, and active duty service members demanding action. Protesters outside the police station now included veterans in uniform, some carrying American flags and military unit banners. The image of uniformed veterans protesting police misconduct was powerful and made national news inside his jail cell. David was largely unaware of the media storm surrounding his case. Inmates and guards had mentioned seeing him on television, but he hadn't been able to watch the coverage himself. His first real understanding of how big the story had become came during a visit from his attorney. "David, your case has become national news," Roberts explained. "The whole country knows about your military service now." David was conflicted about the attention. "I didn't want this to be about my time in the Marines. I just wanted justice as a citizen." "I understand," Roberts replied. "But your service record proves what kind of man you are. It shows the world that Sullivan's accusations are ridiculous." As David sat in his cell that night, he thought about his fellow veterans who had served alongside him. Many of them had struggled with similar issues after returning home, finding work, dealing with injuries, adjusting to civilian life. He wondered how many other veterans had been victims of police misconduct without having video evidence to prove their innocence. The revelation of his military service had changed everything about his case, but David knew the fight for justice was far from over. The whole country was watching now, and failure wasn't an option. The phone call came at 6:30 a.m. on a Friday morning. Police Chief Peterson was still drinking his first cup of coffee when FBI Special Agent Rachel Torres informed him that federal agents would be arriving within the hour to take over the investigation. "This is now a federal civil rights case," Agent Torres explained. "We're looking at potential violations of the Civil Rights Act, conspiracy charges, and possible RICO violations if this pattern of misconduct goes back as far as we suspect." Peterson's worst fears were coming true. What had started as a single officer's misconduct was now a federal investigation that could destroy his entire department. The FBI raid on the police station made national news. Agents seized computers, files, and evidence from dozens of Sullivan's previous cases. They also confiscated Sullivan's personal locker and vehicle. Sullivan himself was arrested at his home that morning. The images of him being led away in handcuffs, broadcast live on television, marked a dramatic reversal from just a week earlier when he had been the arresting officer. The federal charges were serious: conspiracy to violate civil rights, deprivation of rights under color of law, obstruction of justice, and filing false reports. If convicted on all counts, Sullivan faced up to 20 years in federal prison. David was released from jail that same morning. The district attorney, under intense pressure from federal investigators and public opinion, dropped all charges against him. Walking out of the jail was surreal for David. Dozens of reporters and cameras were waiting, along with supporters holding signs reading "Hero comes home" and "Justice for David." David's first statement to the media was brief but powerful. "I want to thank everyone who supported me during this difficult time," he said, standing next to his attorney. "But this isn't just about me. This is about every person who has been falsely accused by corrupt officers. We need to make sure this never happens to anyone else." The impact on the police department was immediate and devastating. Internal Affairs launched investigations into every arrest Sullivan had made in the past 5 years. Defense attorneys filed motions to overturn dozens of convictions. Based on Sullivan's testimony, 3 other officers who had worked closely with Sullivan were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The FBI was examining whether they had knowledge of or participated in the evidence planting scheme. Officer Thompson, the young officer who had been present during David's arrest, came forward with additional information. In a closed-door session with federal investigators, he revealed that Sullivan had made racist comments about suspects on multiple occasions and had bragged about his ability to find evidence when needed. Thompson's cooperation with federal investigators likely saved his career, but it destroyed whatever loyalty remained among the department's rank and file. The police union initially tried to defend Sullivan, but the video evidence was too damaging. Union President Tom Bradley, held a press conference announcing that the union would not be providing legal support for Sullivan's defense. While we believe in supporting our officers, we cannot and will not defend actions that violate the law and betray the public trust, Bradley said. Clearly uncomfortable with the position he was forced to take, the city's legal department was overwhelmed with lawsuits. David's civil rights attorney filed a federal lawsuit seeking millions in damages. More concerning for city officials, attorneys representing Sullivan's previous arrest victims began filing additional suits. Legal expert Professor Linda Washington, no relation to David, appeared on multiple news programs to explain the potential consequences. "We're looking at potentially dozens of wrongful conviction lawsuits," she explained during a television interview. "Each one could result in settlements in the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. The city could be facing financial catastrophe." The political fallout was swift and severe. The mayor, who had initially supported Chief Peterson and defended the department, called for Peterson's resignation. "The citizens of this city deserve better," the mayor announced during an emergency press conference. "We need new leadership to rebuild trust between the police and the community." Peterson resigned the following day, ending a 30-year career in law enforcement. In his resignation letter, he took responsibility for failing to detect and stop Sullivan's misconduct. The appointment of an interim chief brought some stability, but the damage to the department's reputation was enormous. Recruitment numbers plummeted as potential applicants avoided association with the scandal. Community relations hit an all-time low. Minority neighborhoods that had already distrusted police became openly hostile. Crime rates began rising in areas where residents stopped cooperating with police investigations. The federal investigation expanded beyond Sullivan to examine the entire culture of the police department. FBI agents interviewed dozens of officers, citizens, and community leaders about patterns of misconduct and discrimination. What they found was a department where racist attitudes had been tolerated for years, where complaints from minority citizens were routinely dismissed, and where officers like Sullivan felt free to abuse their power without consequences. David's case became a catalyst for broader police reform efforts. Civil rights organizations used his story to push for legislation requiring body cameras, independent oversight of police misconduct investigations, and federal monitoring of problematic departments. The revelation that Sullivan had been planting evidence for years led to a massive review of the entire criminal justice system. The district attorney's office was forced to examine every conviction that relied on Sullivan's testimony. Defense attorney Maria Santos, who had long suspected Sullivan of planting evidence, finally felt vindicated. "This is what we've been saying for years," she told reporters. "Sullivan wasn't just a bad cop. He was a criminal in uniform who destroyed dozens of lives with his lies." The psychological impact on David was complex. While he was grateful for his freedom and the support he had received, he struggled with the knowledge that he might not have been believed without his military service record. "What about all the people who weren't war heroes?" he asked during an interview with a veterans magazine. "What about the people who didn't have video evidence? How many innocent people are sitting in prison because of officers like Sullivan?" David's question resonated throughout the veteran community and beyond. Veterans organizations began advocating for criminal justice reform, arguing that all citizens deserve the same protection from police misconduct regardless of their service record. The case also highlighted broader issues about how American society values different types of citizens. David's military service had made him sympathetic to the public in a way that might not have happened if he had been simply a college student working as an Uber driver. 3 months after his arrest, David returned to college to complete his business degree. The university, which had initially suspended him, not only reinstated him but offered him a full scholarship and a formal apology. His employer at the auto parts store also welcomed him back, though David decided to focus on his studies full-time. Using the settlement money from his civil rights lawsuit, the settlement, while substantial, came with a non-disclosure agreement that prevented David from discussing the specific amount. However, Legal experts estimated it was likely in the millions of dollars. David used a portion of the settlement to establish the Justice for All Foundation, which provided legal assistance to victims of police misconduct who couldn't afford quality representation. Everyone deserves good legal defense, not just war heroes with video evidence, David explained at the foundation's launch event. As Sullivan awaited trial in federal court, more victims of his misconduct came forward. The FBI identified at least 23 cases where Sullivan appeared to have planted evidence or filed false reports. Each new revelation further damaged the police department's reputation and increased the city's legal liability. But for David, the most important outcome was the knowledge that Sullivan would never again be able to destroy an innocent person's life. Justice, while delayed, was finally being served. The federal courthouse was packed on the morning of Officer Derek Sullivan's sentencing. Media representatives, civil rights activists, and dozens of Sullivan's victims filled every available seat. David sat in the front row, wearing the same business shirt he had been arrested in exactly 18 months earlier. The trial had lasted 6 weeks and resulted in convictions on all federal charges. The evidence against Sullivan was overwhelming, not just the video of David's arrest, but testimony from 23 other victims whose lives had been destroyed by planted evidence and false arrests. Judge Patricia Chun, a respected federal judge with 30 years of experience, had heard it all during the trial. Sullivan's defense team had tried everything, claiming the video was misleading, arguing that their client was just doing his job, and even suggesting that David had somehow staged the entire encounter. Nothing worked. The evidence was too clear, and Sullivan's pattern of misconduct was too well documented. As Judge Chun prepared to announce the sentence, Sullivan sat at the defendant's table looking like a broken man. The arrogant, aggressive officer who had terrorized David that night was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to understand that his life as he knew it was over. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Chun began, her voice carrying the weight of justice delayed, but not denied. "You were sworn to protect and serve all citizens equally. Instead, you used your badge and authority to terrorize innocent people based on the color of their skin." She paused, looking directly at Sullivan. "Your actions didn't just violate the law, they violated the fundamental principles that our justice system is built upon." The judge reviewed each of Sullivan's crimes in detail. The evidence planting, the false arrests, the racist behavior, and the conspiracy to cover up his misconduct. Each revelation during the trial had been more damaging than the last. "The court has received letters from dozens of people whose lives you destroyed," Judge Chun continued. "Families torn apart by wrongful convictions. Young people who lost educational opportunities because of criminal records they didn't deserve. Communities that lost faith in law enforcement because of your actions." David watched silently as the judge spoke. He had testified during the trial, describing not just his own experience but the broader impact of Sullivan's misconduct on community trust in police. "However," Judge Chun said, "this case also shows us something positive about our system. It shows us that the truth, even when buried under lies and corruption, will eventually come to light." She looked toward David and the other victims sitting in the courtroom. "It shows us that courage and dignity in the face of injustice can ultimately prevail." The sentence was harsh but fair: 15 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Sullivan would also be required to pay restitution to his victims and would be permanently barred from working in law enforcement. As Sullivan was led away in handcuffs, David felt a complex mix of emotions. There was relief that justice had been served, but also sadness for the lives that had been damaged while Sullivan's crimes went undetected. Outside the courthouse, David spoke to the gathered media for what he said would be the last time about his personal case. "Today's sentence sends a clear message that no one is above the law," he said, "but our work isn't finished. We need to continue reforming our criminal justice system to prevent cases like this from happening in the future." The impact of David's case had indeed led to significant reforms. The police department had implemented mandatory body cameras, created an independent oversight board, and instituted new training programs focused on constitutional rights and bias awareness. More importantly, David's case had inspired similar reforms in police departments across the country. The video of his arrest had become a training tool used in police academies to show officers how not to behave. 6 months after Sullivan's sentencing, David received an unexpected invitation. The police academy where Sullivan had once been trained asked David to speak at their graduation ceremony. Standing at the podium in front of 150 new police officers, David reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 18 months ago, I was arrested by an officer who saw me as a threat because of the color of my skin, David began. He didn't see a veteran who had served his country. He didn't see a college student working to build a better life. He didn't see a human being deserving of respect and dignity. The room was completely silent as David continued. Today I stand before you not seeking revenge, but hoping for change. Each of you has the power to be different. Each of you has the opportunity to serve all citizens with honor and integrity. David spoke about his military service, explaining how the oath he took as a Marine was similar to the oath these new officers would take. Both involved pledging to protect and defend the Constitution and serve something greater than themselves. The badge you're about to receive represents enormous power and responsibility, David said. Use that power to protect the innocent too. Serve those who need help, and to uphold justice for everyone, regardless of their race, background, or circumstances. He concluded his speech with a personal message. I don't hate police officers. My grandfather was a cop, and he taught me to respect law enforcement. But respect must be earned through actions, not just demanded because of a uniform. The standing ovation that followed was long and heartfelt. Several of the graduating officers approached David afterward to thank him and pledged to live up to the standards he had described. David's Justice for All Foundation had grown into a significant force for criminal justice reform. The foundation had provided legal assistance to over 200 victims of police misconduct and had successfully lobbied for legislation strengthening civilian oversight of police departments. The foundation also funded scholarships for minority students pursuing law enforcement careers. Hoping to increase diversity within police departments, David completed his business degree with honors and was accepted to law school. His goal was to become a civil rights attorney, continuing his fight for justice in a different arena. His personal life had also stabilized. The woman he had been dating before his arrest, Jennifer, had stood by him throughout the ordeal. They married in a quiet ceremony attended by family, friends, and several of the veterans who had trained under David during his military service. The city where David was arrested had slowly begun healing the relationship between police and the community. Crime rates had stabilized as trust in law enforcement gradually returned. The new police chief, an African-American woman with a strong reputation for community engagement, had made significant progress in rebuilding bridges, but David knew that his case was just one example of a larger problem that persisted throughout the country. Police misconduct continued to make headlines, and too many innocent people still faced the same injustices he had experienced. During a speech at a criminal justice reform conference, David reflected on the broader meaning of his experience. My case had a happy ending because I had video evidence, because I was a veteran, and because people were willing to fight for me, he said. But justice shouldn't depend on those factors. Everyone deserves equal protection under the law. He paused, thinking about all the victims of police misconduct who hadn't been as fortunate. We've made progress, but we still have work to do. Every day that an innocent person sits in prison because of planted evidence or false testimony is a day that our justice system has failed. David's story had become more than just a tale of one man's fight against injustice. It had become a symbol of hope that change was possible, that ordinary citizens could stand up to corruption and win. As he looked toward the future, David remained committed to the fight for justice. His military service had taught him to never leave a fallen comrade behind. Now, he applied that same principle to his civilian life, never leaving behind those who faced injustice and couldn't fight for themselves. the boy who had grown up believing in the American dream, the young man who had served his country with honor, and the civilian who had faced corruption and emerged victorious had all merged into someone dedicated to making that dream a reality for everyone. In the end, that might be the greatest victory of all.